Mason never expected his life to tilt on its axis because of Scott Whitmore. The golden boy, the school's pride, the walking embodiment of confidence. From the outside, Scott's life seemed perfectly constructed, effortless charm. A natural athlete, a girlfriend that turned heads. Mason, on the other hand, existed in the quiet corners. Behind the glow of his computer screen. His world built from lines of code and the well-worn pages of science fiction novels. But friendship had a way of bridging even the widest gaps. Scott had chosen him. In freshman year, out of everyone, maybe it was the easy conversations. The balance they provided each other, Scott pulling Mason out of his shell. Mason grounding Scott when his world spun too fast. It worked. It had always worked. Until lately. Until Mason started noticing the way Scott lingered too long after practice. The way he looked at him when he thought Mason wasn't paying attention. Until a touch, meant to be incidental, lasted longer than necessary. There was a tension neither of them acknowledged. Coiled tight, waiting. And on one crisp autumn afternoon, Scott asked a question that made Mason's pulse stutter, one that cracked the foundation of everything they thought they knew. The shift was subtle at first. A quiet hum beneath the surface of their friendship. Something neither of them dared to name. Scott had always been comfortable, too comfortable. His arms slung over Mason's shoulders in the hall. His knee pressed against his in the backseat of a car. The easy way he sprawled across Mason's bed during late-night study sessions. It was casual, innocent, at least, that's what Mason had always told himself. But lately, Scott wasn't just close, he was lingering. It started with the way his fingers brushed against Mason's when they passed a controller during their usual gaming nights. Then, the way he'd sit just a little too close. Shoulders touching, his cologne thick in the air between them. Mason felt it every time, the heat of Scott's presence. The electric pulse beneath his skin. Then, one evening, as they sat side by side on Mason's couch, Scott broke the silence with a question that made Mason's stomach tighten. Have you ever thought about guys? Mason's grip on his textbook tightened. He knew what Scott was really asking. What do you mean? Mason's voice came out steadier than he felt. Scott exhaled, running a hand through his hair, looking anywhere but at Mason. For the first time in all their years of friendship, he looked nervous. I don't know, Scott muttered. Sometimes I think about things I shouldn't. And just like that, the air between them shifted, thick with something that neither of them could ignore. The moment stretched between them, fragile and heavy, as if the wrong word might shatter everything they'd built. Scott had never been hesitant about anything before. He spoke with certainty, moved with confidence, lived like the world bent to his will. But now, sitting there, fingers digging into his jeans, lips parted like he was holding back something dangerous, he was anything but sure. Mason swallowed, his pulse hammering in his throat. This wasn't a game. This wasn't Scott cracking some offhand joke, teasing him the way he always did. This was something real, something raw, something Mason had dreamed about but never dared to believe could be true. Scott, he started, but the other boy shook his head, exhaling sharply. I don't know what's wrong with me, Scott muttered, his voice unsteady, eyes flicking to Mason's lips for a fraction of a second too long. Mason's breath caught. Had he imagined that? The way Scott's gaze dipped. The way he shifted closer. Like he was fighting something inside himself? There's nothing wrong with you, Mason murmured. He should have stopped there. He should have created space. Let Scott figure this out on his own. But he didn't move. And neither did Scott. Then, as if the air between them became too charged, too unbearable, Scott leaned in. Just enough that Mason felt his breath ghost over his lips. And for the first time, Scott Whitmore hesitated. Waiting. Giving Mason the chance to decide. Mason could have stopped it. Should have. The space between them had never felt this small. This charged, like a live wire sparking between their skin. Scott's breath was warm against his lips. His usual confidence unraveling into something tentative. Something fragile. His eyes, usually sharp and full of mischief, were wide now, searching Mason's face for permission. For something neither of them had ever dared to name. Mason's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. His body frozen between instinct and fear. Was this real? Was this happening? Scott. His voice was barely above a whisper. But he didn't pull away. Scott swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Just tell me to stop. He said it like he wanted Mason to, like he was waiting for an escape. An excuse to pretend this wasn't happening. But Mason knew the truth. Scott didn't want to stop. And neither did he. So instead of saying no, instead of pushing Scott back, Mason did the only thing he had ever truly wanted to do. He leaned in. Their lips met in a slow, tentative press, soft, warm, uncertain. Scott inhaled sharply against him, his hands twitching like he didn't know where to put them. Then, something shifted. The hesitation cracked, giving way to heat, to hunger. Scott groaned softly, gripping the front of Mason's hoodie, pulling him closer. And just like that, years of restraint, of denial, of silence, burned away in a single kiss. Number 5. Write more smoothly and creatively. ChatGPT da noi. The world outside that kiss ceased to exist. Scott wasn't just kissing him, he was devouring him. His grip tightening like he was afraid Mason might disappear. The hesitancy from earlier was gone, replaced by something raw, something desperate. Mason had spent years imagining this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the real thing. Scott tasted like mint and something warm, something holy him. His hands, rough from years of football, slid up Mason's sides, curling into the fabric of his hoodie like he needed something to hold onto. Mason shivered, his body lighting up under Scott's touch, responding in ways he'd never allowed himself to think about. They broke apart just long enough to breathe, foreheads pressed together, breaths ragged and unsteady. "Shit," Scott whispered, his fingers still gripping Mason's hoodie. His voice was wrecked, dazed, like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. Mason swallowed, his lips tingling, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you freaking out?" Scott exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, yes, I don't know." He let out a nervous laugh, then glanced up, eyes dark and unreadable. "But I don't want to stop." Mason's stomach flipped. This was dangerous. This was reckless. And yet, when Scott leaned in again, Mason didn't pull away. Because this wasn't just a mistake. This was something inevitable. And neither of them was ready to walk away from it. Not now, not ever. The secret was intoxicating at first. A thrilling, reckless kind of hunger that neither of them could ignore. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch in the school hallway sent a shiver down Mason's spine. A reminder of what they had done, of what they kept doing. Scott was magnetic, always had been, but now that pull was unbearable. They tried to be careful, tried to act normal, but the tension between them was different now, charged, alive, impossible to contain. Nights turned into a blur of whispered confessions, of bodies pressed together in the dark, of hands mapping unfamiliar territory, learning, wanting more. Scott would show up at Mason's house unannounced, shoving him against the door the moment it closed, lips insistent, desperate. "I can't stop thinking about you," Scott murmured one night, his fingers tracing fire along Mason's skin. "It's driving me insane." Mason had no answer. He only knew that he felt it too, this impossible, unstoppable thing between them. But outside of these stolen moments, reality pressed in. Scott still had a girlfriend, Tessa, oblivious, still smiled at him in the hallways. Mason hated himself for it, hated how much he wanted something that wasn't his to have. And Scott was breaking, torn between who he was supposed to be and what he truly wanted. It wasn't sustainable. Something had to give. And Mason had a sinking feeling that when it did, everything would come crashing down. It all came crashing down faster than Mason expected. Scott had been unraveling for weeks, his usual confidence fraying at the edges, his easy smiles forced, his laughter hollow. He still kissed Mason like he was starving for something he couldn't name. Still showed up at his door in the dead of night, hands shaking as he pulled Mason close. But outside of those moments, when daylight exposed the lies they were living, Scott was slipping. Then, one careless mistake shattered everything. They weren't thinking when it happened, too lost in the moment. Too caught up in the gravity between them. The empty classroom was supposed to be safe. Just a quick meeting before Scott's practice. But one kiss turned into another. Turned into Scott pressing Mason against the desk. Hands fisting in his hoodie. Lips hot and desperate against his skin. And then, the sharp intake of breath. The sound of books dropping to the floor. Mason froze. Scott's entire body went rigid. Tessa stood in the doorway. Eyes wide, shock giving way to devastation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "So this is why?" Scott didn't answer. He couldn't. Mason wanted to say something, to fix it, to undo it, but there was nothing to say. The door slammed behind her, leaving them in suffocating silence. And in that moment, Mason knew, they weren't just a secret anymore. They were exposed. And the fallout was coming. The fallout was immediate, and brutal. Tessa didn't spread rumors, she didn't have to. The shift in her was enough. The way she walked past Scott in the hall without looking at him. The way she avoided Mason's eyes like he was a stranger. People noticed, they whispered, and it didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Scott tried to act like nothing had changed. But Mason saw through him. He saw the way Scott's jaw clenched when teammates asked why he and Tessa suddenly weren't speaking. The way he hesitated before answering. Before laughing it off with a lie Mason could hear cracking beneath the surface. And then, the first real blow. Scott was late to practice one afternoon, Mason didn't know why. Until later, when Ivy found him by the lockers. Her face tense. It was Ryan and Lucas. She said, they cornered him after school. Asked him outright if the rumors were true. Mason felt his stomach drop. And? Ivy exhaled sharply. He denied it. The words punched the air from Mason's lungs. Scott had a choice, a moment to be brave. And he had chosen the lie. That night, Scott came over, but Mason didn't let him in right away. Did you mean it? Mason asked, voice hoarse. Scott ran a hand through his hair. Looking wrecked. I didn't know what else to do. Mason swallowed the ache in his throat. Because he did. And maybe, that was the worst part. Scott showed up at Mason's door 3 days later. Soaked from the rain, his hoodie clinging to his skin. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there. Breathing hard, eyes pleading. Mason wanted to be angry. Wanted to shut the door. Tell him to leave, to deal with the mess he'd made. But he couldn't. Instead, he stepped aside, letting Scott in. They stood in the dimly lit entryway. Water dripping from Scott's hair onto the floor. Tension thick enough to choke. I can't do this without you, Scott whispered finally, voice rough. Mason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You don't get to say that. Not after. I know, Scott cut in, stepping closer. I know I screwed up. I was scared, Maze, but I'm done hiding. Mason searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt. He found none. Then show me. Scott's breath hitched. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for Mason's hand, lacing their fingers together. Holding on, not letting go. Mason let out a shaky laugh. Relief in something else, something warmer. Something permanent, spreading through his chest. Maybe, finally, they were done running.